What's up, guys? Welcome back to another edition of Before the Whistle presented by BRK Insurance Group. If your business is looking for the best in employee benefits, commercial property and casualty insurance, or retirement and 401k plan services, there's no one better suited to meet your challenges and build a plan centered around your needs than BRK Insurance Group. Welcome back, y'all, to Before the Whistle. As you know, I'm your host, Maddy. If you're watching the video version of this, then you can see that I am back at my home in New Orleans. I was down in Mobile, Alabama this last week for the Senior Bowl. This is my second season, or not my first, or it was my third Senior Bowl, second season going down there to primarily focus on covering not one, but two Tulane guys. And I'll admit it was a lot easier to follow along this year with both of them being on the same side of the ball, and Jha'Quan Jackson and Michael Pratt over from Tulane. And I know that I did my last week's episodes really focusing on Mobile, but there's a lot to talk about when you talk about the Senior Bowl. I had really only had one day of practice before I filmed my first episode of that week. The practice starts on Tuesday of that week. The Monday is kind of picking up your credentials, getting oriented with things. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday are really what matters down there for the Senior Bowl. And so my Friday episode, I was able to look back at that week of practice and specifically kind of focus on Michael Pratt, just knowing that quarterback is really king, and being a little harder on him in my first episode of that week. After that first day, just looking like might have been in his head a little bit. I think it's a little unignorable just with the way that the Senior Bowl is designed and how much of a mental load there really is on quarterbacks. But I spent most of my Friday episode focusing on Michael Pratt and his background. And I want to give some flowers again to Jha'Quan Jackson, who had a really strong week. And I think he is the perfect example for what the Senior Bowl can do for some of these guys and how important it can be to really put your all into that week of practice. I am going to kind of open it just talking about what the Senior Bowl is and what people I think are really looking for out of that week of practice and why you just can't take that much away from that game. And then just kind of looking at how those guys have been on and off the field, looking back at my game notes, going through some of my sideline reports throughout this year, because it wasn't the best year on offense for Tulane. And so if you had centered in on Jha'Quan Jackson and Michael Pratt, perhaps this time last year, coming off of the Cotton Bowl where they scored 46 points, Jha'Quan Jackson had something like an 87-yard touchdown in that game. And then unfortunately, the way the season ended for Tulane this year and just the way that their offense was designed didn't necessarily prop either of them up on a pedestal. It did win football games, and it got them the opportunity to go to one of these showcases and make the most out of that. And so just kind of bolstering what traits and what characteristics you could see from those guys down in Mobile, and then knowing what I know about them as people. And I'm going to try to do, so I'm just going to kind of talk about fit. I know that now that we're entering draft land, this is my first time covering it from a college football perspective, really going into the draft and taking that really head on, knowing that these guys, especially with all these teams being quarterback needy, but I've admitted that I'm a defense person and I don't pretend to scout positions that I haven't gone through the certification and training for through the scouting academy. And so I can only say that about defensive back. But I think when we talk about fit, there's so much that goes into that. And so looking at kind of what I've done in the scouting academy at other positions, but just having that conversation about when you're talking about fit, when you're talking about what a player can do and cannot do, and how that helps all of this draft discourse. Now, before I kind of break down the individual performance, specifically of Jha'Quan Jackson, and kind of talk about my more philosophical stuff, which I want to get more into this offseason about what fit and projections really mean, I just want to take a quick minute and recap really what the Senior Bowl is, because I realize that I'm saying this and I know that people probably have a general understanding. Some people might not have any idea what I'm talking about, though. And as I've always said, I want to inform and educate and not go over people's heads. So just to kind of quickly recap, the Senior Bowl is a college showcase for guys going on to the draft that are selected by a group of scouts way before you would have any kind of guesses as to how early they really fill their board out. And Michael Pratt was one of those very early priority invites, but that all gets built. And then they all come down here for a week of practice. And it's been different every year I've been here, although I think that they're starting to kind of hammer out their process, at least for the coaching staff, because just a few years prior, what they would do was have a team from the NFL's entirety of their coaching staff be the American team or the national team. Those are the two teams for the Senior Bowl. And so my first year, I believe it was the Lions and the Jets. Very cool to see Dan Campbell out in the wild and see what his coaching staff was able to do that first year. But I always just had the feeling that, there's probably more, if you were able to open this up a little bit, more suited guys for these opportunities, and just the ability to give guys that might not otherwise have this chance an elevated opportunity to show off their ability to coach up a group of guys in that position group, being the OC or the head coach of the Senior Bowl. And so what they've started doing now more is there is no kind of rhyme or reason in the sense of, oh, well, this is all just from the Lions team. There is, the Jets coach, the Arizona coach was a position group coach, and it's guys that are in these elevated roles. And so they're trying to prove themselves just as much as these guys are out there on this practice field. But these guys who have been used to a system, and I think both Michael Pratt and Jha'Quan Jackson have shown their ability to adapt and thrive in several different offensive systems just in my 3 years over here at Tulane. But it is just really bare bones once you actually get to the game portion of it. It's really the practice that matters. And the more that I go to the Senior Bowl and the more that I take some notes, take a step back, and try to kind of think about the guys I know and what traits they're kind of displaying out there, it really sticks out to me that it's really not that much about the reps at all. And it's really not about the game whatsoever. The reps are certainly important. And I think if you go into the Senior Bowl with a higher stock, like some of the national quarterbacks, let's say, Bo Nix, Michael Penix Jr., and Sam Hartman, some of them had worse weeks than others, but it matters a lot more when they're in this kind of spotlight as these top quarterbacks. And so there is a lot more, I think, of just a relaxation ability for these guys out of Tulane, but it's a double-edged sword in that you're not going to be the ones that are the headline names getting that automatic attention. And so can you command that attention yourself? From a wide receiver like Jha'Quan Jackson, are you able to adapt to different quarterback styles? Are you going to give a route 110% every single rep, no matter who's in front of you, no matter what coverage you're in? Are you going to get frustrated if the ball isn't coming your way or the quarterback is throwing balls over your head? And then the quarterback has all of that, but tenfold, where they're trying to assimilate to these guys, to this playbook. You're trying to learn these plays. You're trying to impress scouts, and you're trying to help your teammates out just as much, because if Michael Pratt doesn't do well, let's say he gets a missnap, then the play is dead. It doesn't matter what those wide receivers were all trying to do or showcase if he misreads the route. And I posted a video of this on Twitter, and I talked about this in length on my Friday episode, but the fact that Michael Pratt was tracking down these receivers one-on-one, going over the routes with them, and especially doing so after the things weren't going so well for him. Things aren't always going to go well for you in the NFL, but how do you respond? How do you handle adversity? How do you handle not playing at your best? How do you handle a group of men and assemble strangers and get them to trust you, have chemistry and rapport with them? And that's really, to me, where Michael Pratt shined throughout the week. Whereas Jha'Quan Jackson, he very much just shined a lot by what he was doing on the practice field itself. And I know that I'm going back and forth between how important those reps are, but for a guy like Jha'Quan Jackson, who I don't think anyone really saw coming going into the Senior Bowl, for him to do what he did throughout that week, consistently beat guys in coverage, beat them one-on-one. And when I talked to him going into this week, I know that he really wanted to work on his separation ability and has been at, I believe it's XPE facility in Florida. And Dorian Williams is the one who gave him that recommendation, but he really wanted to work on his tempo coming in and out of his breaks and his ability to separate in doing so, and having those moves and not just relying on his speed, knowing that once you get to the NFL, even if you have track speed, well, so do all of the cornerbacks. So you have to really add to your repertoire. And that's what I saw the most out of Jha'Quan Jackson this week. And then the feedback that I was hearing, again, from people that were coaching him up throughout the week, he got really good feedback in his responsiveness to coaching, not being afraid to ask questions. It cracked me up when I talked to him before we went down to Mobile. He had said something about Connor Sager was his coach. He works for the Cardinals. He was a wide receiver position group coach. And he said that, he'd looked up the names of his nephews, and he asked them how they were doing when he saw Connor that first day of practice, and recited all of his coaching stops. And it was funny, but it just goes to show how serious Jha'Quan Jackson was taking this entire opportunity and really grabbing hold of it. Again, asking those questions in meeting rooms, not being afraid to ask those questions and stand up and ask that. I mean, the first couple of days is very awkward, I think, at the Senior Bowl. You're trying to get used to being in these new position group meetings with a group of strangers, a strange coach, and knowing that essentially your entire career is on the line. And I've heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, and it wouldn't surprise me either way, but I have heard things about them purposely throwing bad things into the playbook to see if a player has the presence to be able to say, this doesn't make sense, or ask a question about it, or just kind of go along with it because they're not really going to be that leader type of guy. And again, I don't know how much it is that they're purposely putting poison plays in there, for lack of a better term, but I think it's really important to be that active participant in those meetings. And I think it really speaks to the coachability of both Michael Pratt and Jha'Quan Jackson. And a lot of that coming from, again, Willie Fritz and Tulane and all of those little things, just the fact that they're all really conditioned to hand the ball off to the referee when the play is over, even doing so in practice. But Jha'Quan Jackson is the type of guy that he cleaned the locker room up by himself a lot of the time during the season, never asked for help, never asked for any recognition. Willie Fritz was the one that would bring it up whenever he would receive some type of accolade, because it's just about the person as it is the player. And as much as we could talk about really, really good wide receivers, there are ones that are going to be problematic and can be divas, can be overly cocky. And it's really hard to balance that confidence in yourself with still not kind of going over that line into I'm the best and I need to get every single target territory. It really, really stuck out to me about Jha'Quan that he was willing to be in whatever role he was placed in. And you could already see that taking its legs at the Senior Bowl this week. I think if he was one of the guys that helped his draft stock the most without question. And it was just the totality of the type of guy that he is. But people, had texted me the day of the Senior Bowl asking me if I was in town, where I was sitting. And to be honest with them, I was sitting in a car heading back to New Orleans, just again, exhausted from that week. But there's just absolutely nothing that you can really take away from the Senior Bowl game and say that that is really an indictment, or, there's certainly some positive times, but anyone that watched that knows that it was a rough day, especially for the quarterbacks out there. And what happens at the Senior Bowl as well is you have all these position groups. They have all this individualized practice during the week. Some guys help themselves so much in 2 or 3 days of practice that even the Thursday practice is very bare bones. There are a lot of guys that had really strong first 2 days and don't want to get hurt. There was a injury or two that last day of practice, and I don't remember what day it was, but Dorian Williams broke his wrist the last day of practice, I believe, last year. So it just does go to show that there always is going to be a risk here. And so there were so many players gone this year that for the first time in Senior Bowl history, Jim Nagy had to call a defensive lineman that morning and ask him if they would be willing to switch teams the day of the game because they could not field enough guys on the team. And so now you have someone that has been practicing, even though it's been very light and there's not been that much work, with an entirely different group of people and coaching staff the entire week, and now has to go play on the other side of the ball. And then you had Michael Penix Jr. for the national team not playing in the game. Bo Nix only played a series or two. And so Sam Hartman was just kind of thrown to the wolves on the national team, for better or for worse. And unfortunately, it just wasn't getting that much better for him. But the other side of the coin on the American team also really goes to show how little meaning you can derive from the game itself, where there were 4 quarterbacks on the American team and Spencer Rattler got the start. He made the absolute most of it. I'd say he was the best quarterback without question on the day for the Senior Bowl. And I believe he gets a series or 2 series. And then Joe Milton from Tennessee comes in. He gets a series or 2. And then Michael Pratt enters the game off the bench. And I know that that's kind of what I said on my last episode. He's known for doing that, given that that's how he started his career at Tulane. But it's very difficult to come in off the bench and be the 3rd quarterback in rotation. These guys might have just gotten used to the throwing motion and the touch of the guy prior. And now the receivers are getting that swapped out as well. And Michael Pratt didn't have a very good series. He threw 2 incompletions, and then he got a little bit of time before halftime. And he could have probably made some better plays and gotten them out of bounds, used a timeout and had them kick a field goal before half, but they're only able to run certain plays and the defense is only allowed to run certain coverages. I don't remember the exact what it is, but it's very pared down. It's something like they can only run cover 1 and cover 3. and there's a certain rules about what they can and can't do, can only use like 11, 12, and it may be 13 personnel, maybe it's 10. I can't remember, but there's only 3 personnel groupings that the teams are allowed to use. And so when you're talking about assessing someone's decision making and their situational awareness, for me, it's really hard to do that when it's not even close to being a simulated game setting where I take a lot more away from the practice reps because I've seen so much practice now as a sideline reporter that I know you can't take that much away from it, but you can certainly see improvement, growth, coachability out of that practice time. You can't see any of that out of this type of setting. And then the only other chance Michael Pratt had was, I believe it was the final series of the game, and he ends up throwing an interception on a Hail Mary. And it just kind of like, what are we doing here? And it's not an indictment on the Senior Bowl. And it's not an indictment on anyone really. But I think for people that bother to criticize the performance of players in the game itself, I think it really, really helps, at least for me, knowing these guys and knowing how they perform and knowing how they compete and just the role of quarterback. I mean, to me, what makes a quarterback great is it's almost like a dance, and how they dance throughout a game, how they handle the changing of momentum and how they get into a rhythm. And you have to be able to pick up your teammates, lead those guys, make decisions that are, yes, based on situational context in that moment. But if you haven't been in the game at all before, you don't know really if this guy that you've been targeting all week in practice, all of a sudden he's not able to separate. Now you have to go to try to find a guy that you might not have had that much chemistry with during the week. And, Michael Pratt took some checkdowns to the running backs, but sometimes in the NFL, that is the correct move. And it might not have been in that exact moment, but you're also asking a quarterback to take half their skill set and then make their best decisions based off that. Where I think if they were able to utilize all the personnel they wanted, all of the coverages that they wanted, you're able to read that a little better, and you could at least kind of see what a quarterback's decision making would be in a vacuum. But to me, it was just impossible when you're shuffled in and out like that, and that affects the receivers just as much, where all of a sudden, again, they might have gotten the rhythm down with Spencer Rattler, and then Joe Milton comes in, and some guy that was hot in the first series now goes completely cold, and then Michael Pratt comes in and has to reheat up the situation, and then Carter Bradley comes in after halftime. It just really is a lot of chaos. And again, there is a reason that a lot of people leave before that game. And, Jha'Quan Jackson didn't get targeted that much in the game. So if you're not getting targeted that often, I don't know what you're really supposed to be able to show off. And that's why we have game film. And that's why this is, again, I think the word showcase is really the correct term for it, where you're going to have the pro day, you're going to have combines, but I think really just the exercise itself of how they interact with a new coaching staff, if they're able to raise their hand, not be afraid to ask questions, if they're able to be leaders. To me, that's what made Jha'Quan Jackson great, Michael Pratt great, all of these guys. I have so many guys that I want to talk about. Speaking of, Jarius Monroe, again, being MVP of the East West Shrine Bowl, just incredible knowing the type of person that he is. So maybe I'll do a defense-minded draft coverage because there's plenty of offseason to be had here, but really just focusing on the Senior Bowl and these two guys' performance. I did just want to kind of go back and look throughout the year and just see if there are moments that I could point to tell the story about who Jha'Quan Jackson is, who Michael Pratt is, in a way that, we don't have to give these limitations about, well, they were only able to be in X personnel and X type of coverage in this weird situation. There's plenty of games you can go back and look for, but I've always said that my time on the sideline, the most valuable part of it is everything that happens in between snaps. The reason that my podcast is called Before the Whistle was specifically developed out of the idea that I see so much in the offseason at practice with these guys that tells so much more of a story than just doing some snap analysis of what you see on the football field, which is sometimes a necessary part of this industry. But when I have the ability to go in these meetings and see how these guys interact with each other and know the type of guys that they are, have the ability to see everything at practice, the ins and outs of game plans and installs, being able to talk with the coaching staff at Tulane, it's just brought such a greater understanding for me to football and given me a lot of stories to tell about some of these guys. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course they like the product, they're paid to. Well, if you know me at all, then you know two things. One, I'm truthful, almost to a fault. And two, if I were in it for the money, well, then I would certainly be doing something else. So believe me when I say that I love Blue Oak Barbecue. The food, the drinks, the people, the location, yes, all of it. Blue Oak Barbecue has a great selection of your favorites from the smoker, fantastic sides, and as I always continue to attest to, awesome bar specials, including one this week. So go check them out. Blue Oak Barbecue, 900 North Carrollton Avenue here in New Orleans, or visit them online at blueoakbarbecue.com. Speaking of that awesome bar special, again, happy Mardi Gras, y'all, as we continue to go through these next couple weeks of the Mardi Gras season here in New Orleans. No better special for Blue Oak Barbecue than their king cake daiquiri. And they have an extra shot option this year where for just $5, you can add a shot of white chocolate strawberry, apple pie, or banana cream moonshine. You might be thinking those might sound a little insane with a king cake daiquiri. MJ Lloyd at Blue Oak Barbecue is a mixologist for you, and I recommend that y'all go over and get yourself one. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course they like the product, they're paid to. Well, if you know me, what I found interesting when I went back through my notes that I've taken throughout the year, just looking back on moments for Jha'Quan Jackson and Michael Pratt, the moments that actually stuck out to me more were when they weren't in the game. There were some instances, the first game against South Alabama, you could see just the connection and leadership between Michael Pratt and Jha'Quan Jackson, where there was an incompletion on third down thrown to Jha'Quan Jackson. You could see Michael Pratt get frustrated with himself. But after that, he went over, tracked down Jha'Quan Jackson and reminded him that was a good route that you just ran right now. And after that, the next series, they go out and he throws a 47-yard touchdown to Jha'Quan Jackson, and he had another 48-yard touchdown in that game. The next game on the year was the Ole Miss game, and Jha'Quan Jackson stepped up early in that game for Kai Horton. He had a 41-yard touchdown, but it was just really not a day that the offense was able to get it done. And what stuck out the most about Michael Pratt in that game for not playing was the amount of leadership that he had and ability to put whatever his feelings were down in that situation. And it wasn't the first time I've seen him be so selfless when he's not playing in a game, just like the Houston game that they won in overtime the season prior. He was meeting with Kai Horton before the game started. During defensive series, there was a point where I saw him chase down and grab a towel for our running back, Mekhi Hughes. He was stepping in the O-line huddles and hyping up individual players throughout the game. And Kai Horton was crying at the end of the game, and he went over to him and gave him a hug and told him not to cry, that he played his heart out and he should be proud of that. And to me, that's when you really see a true leader and a guy that has a true connection with his teammates, is one that's able to do so when they are normally the guy at quarterback, but they have to take that backseat role. And so seeing how much he lifted up the guy that stepped in his place and the way that he was going into all of these huddles, and you see him do it all the time throughout the year, going over to the wide receivers, tracking them down, just like I saw him doing in Mobile, making sure that they're on the same page. And you saw him do that in Memphis when they were having some issues earlier on this year, and a lot of frustrations in the conference championship game that a lot of people could have just crumbled and started yelling at each other. And there were times where there were some wide receivers that were super frustrated with Michael Pratt, who was in his final game at Yeoman Stadium. He knows that. He probably has a sense that this game is not going that well. He's not feeling that great. And having these guys kind of barking, I think everyone was just really upset. The emotions were just very high. And him really going over, chasing these guys down one-on-one, just calming them down, asking them what's going on. And I remember he asked one, "Do you trust me?" And he said yes. And that's really all that needed to be said between those two guys. But Michael's ability to just chill out and temper these types of waters and not take things personally has always really stuck out to me. And then Jha'Quan Jackson had some absences this year, and you could tell it really affected these guys. It was in Rice where he got knocked out pretty much on one of his, I don't know if he actually brought the ball in for a touchdown. I don't think he did, because that was the one field goal that Valentino Ambrosio, I think, missed in that game. It was right after Jha'Quan was knocked out for a good 3-4 minutes straight. And you could tell how much his absence just affected the wide receiver psyche in that game. I went back and listened, and it was so apparent that I did a sideline report about that and what the coaching staff was really telling them. And it wasn't until Jha'Quan Jackson came back out and put a headset on that everyone kind of was rejuvenated. And he did that throughout several games where he wasn't playing this year, having that headset on, chasing people down, really, kind of gassing up these individual guys, but kind of playing coach in that way. And it stuck out to me in the Tulsa game this year as well. I wrote that he still has a role on the sideline and displaying this leadership, even though he wasn't in that game. And that to me is just as important. And going over to comfort another guy that was injured, Lawrence Keys, when he was also out with an injury, you could tell that he was just down because it was a game that really came down to the wire. It was one we really could have used a wide receiver or two for. And those guys were kind of hoping that they might be able to be back in time for that game. So for him to be comforting another injured player when he's also going on to the draft and knows that his time to showcase his talents is running out really sticks out to me. And then there was a quote that I caught from him to the players on the sideline of, if we get the ball back, let's get this game clock down, stay locked in and go win this football game, knowing that they had that ability to dominate those end of the game drives and to have, again, an injured wide receiver be stepping up and having this much leadership. That is really going to take you a long way. And that to me is really what makes these two guys great, is it's not just what they're able to do on the field when all of the lights are on them, but it's what they do on the sidelines when they're not the guy, when they're not even playing in that game, and having the selflessness to just be a true teammate. And to me, the character of the Tulane guys, it just continues to be miles away the best trait about every single one of them. And so looking forward and looking at fits and projections and what have you, there is a lot that we're never going to know about things. And I think that there's probably a lot of instances where guys get skipped over during the draft where it seems like it's a perfect fit. It seems like it's a need for them and you have a really high grade on them and it doesn't fit with that team for one reason or another. A lot of the time that can be personality. It can be character. And there are guys that come to the Senior Bowl that do have character flags, and that is their opportunity to really meet with teams and quell those storms if they're able to. But there were not only no character concerns with Jha'Quan Jackson, Michael Pratt, and any of these draft prospects for that matter, but everything is so overwhelmingly positive when you look at who they are as people. Again, when you look at the fact that Jha'Quan Jackson cleans up the locker room by himself after every game, win or lose, it just speaks to the types of guys that they are. The fact that Ole Miss game was Michael Pratt's giant showcase. That was the game. It was the game. And it comes out that morning that he's not able to play. And instead of sulking, he's really doing his best to keep not only the quarterback in his place lifted up, but the entirety of his team. And it wasn't just individual players on offense. I was standing on a bench at one point during that game and I looked and Michael Pratt was standing on the other side of it, trying to get the crowd up, talking with the defensive guys. It just how active and present he was on the sideline really, really stuck out. And so they'll fit in any locker room when it comes down to when you're talking about that. And I'm sure that, it requires a lot of research when I'm talking about scheme and fit. I was going to say, I'm sure I could project some of these things, but just to kind of wrap this up, talking about how many factors go into scheme, projection, and fit when we talk about these guys to just hopefully educate people and add to the conversation as we move forward in this draft process is when I've done the scouting academy, if you have a player that you look at, you not only have to look at the context of that season, you have to look at your coaching staff, what the philosophy of that team is. For example, I was looking at a defensive lineman who came over from a 3-4 system and wasn't really that great in it because he wasn't able to use his skill set and was primarily stuck in double teams. And it was a switch that they had made that year after he had spent his first year in a 4-3. And so you're switching around all of these schemes and you're trying to figure out what a guy does best. And I think D lineman is a little easier to kind of talk about because you can cut a lot of guys out, although you can move a lot of guys from, like I talked about in my episode on whether or not Tulane switching to a 3-4, could move a lot of 3-4 nose tackles to 4-3 defensive tackles, or I'm sorry, ends in a 3-4. You can move them to defensive tackles in a 4-3, but it requires that extra step. And it's the idea that you could have two coaches at the Senior Bowl looking at a player, looking at exactly the same things and have completely different conclusions, even if they have the same evaluation, because it just depends what they're looking for. And so it'll depend on what a team is looking for in a quarterback. It'll depend on what a team is looking for in a wide receiver and every one of these positions for that matter. but then it matters how their offense or their defense is run, what schemes they utilize, what holes they have on their roster that this guy may or may not be a good fit for. Where if it was a year where they hadn't just drafted a really good wide receiver the year prior, they would probably take someone in that spot this year. But, those kind of things happen, or there's a last minute injury to a player on their team at the end of the season, and it makes them really reevaluate what their process is. You're just never going to know these things. But when I start kind of talking about scheme and fit, it is going to take me a while. And I might be overdoing it here, but I don't just really see any value in throwing out these random teams where, yeah, Michael Pratt has been linked over to Denver, and on its face, it makes sense to me. When you're talking about a fit, I know that Sean Payton has always kind of wanted that mobility in his quarterbacks. You can tell that by the guys that he was drafting towards the end of his time on the Saints and what kind of position, what kind of traits he coveted in that aspect. But Drew Brees was his quarterback forever for a reason. And that cerebral ability, the ability to make checks, dissect defenses, and be your own leader out there, execute a 2-minute offense. Those are things that Sean Payton is likely looking for out of his quarterback. But Michael Pratt also would really stand to go somewhere where he's in an offense that is designed around his strengths and that he might have a year to develop. And it's not me saying that he doesn't have the capability to be a starter, but I don't always think that rookie quarterbacks should be thrown into the fire. I mean, your brain is still developing until you're 25 years old. And primarily your frontal lobe is the one that's behind the 8 ball here. And that is where your foresight is, your mental processing, your decision-making, your emotion, just all of these things that they're not fully developed. And then they're out in these really high pressure situations. So going somewhere where he might not have to start right away would be really the best thing for him. But just to kind of break it down, on how specific these things can really be. And so when you're kind of, perhaps if you're looking out there trying to see what team might take Jha'Quan Jackson, for example, as I've said before, I am much more of a defense-minded person, and I've only done defensive back throughout the scouting academy, although defensive back encompasses cornerback, strong safety, free safety, and nickel. It really, just going back through those reports, gave me a lot of context as to how specific of a fit it really is for teams. Where I went back and looked at one of the defensive backs that I had scouted through the scouting academy, and you have to project what their fit is. And you start with a context section where, game starts, any injuries, things like that, if they've been a captain, and then the coaches that they played for, what their schemes have been, and how they've primarily been utilized. So before you even get to their traits, you have that context of who they are as a player. When you think about someone like Jha'Quan Jackson and perhaps a knock on him being that he didn't have that many catches this year, to me, that is a failure to understand, or a desire to understand, how Tulane's offense worked this year. The fact that there really has never been a number one guy. It has always been a team effort. It's highly specific based on game plan. There are games where Jha'Quan Jackson was the number one wide receiver. There were games where it was Chris Brazzell or Lawrence Keys or all three of them at the same time. But that's not a bad thing. There are a lot of systems out there that do the same thing, that spread the same wealth. And do you have the ability to carry that mentality and be a role player if need be? It is an extremely important trait to consider. And so those are just all things that I'm trying to keep in mind. But just breaking down one term from the Scouting Academy that I hope will show people how difficult it really is to project and how much there really needs to just be due diligence when you're thinking about these things. I was looking at a safety and I was assessing his ability to have range. And the term range is, do they have the ability to get to the ball from a deep zone without laboring? And then if so, what routes they can get to, and if they can do so from a single high alignment or a 2 high alignment. Because safety's coverage, I don't want to get, over my head here, but you're either primarily in split safety coverage or single high safety coverage. And then it just depends on whether you're in man or zone, what's going on underneath there. But when you think of someone like Marcus Williams, who just roamed back there as that kind of free safety, and then the Saints had such a defined box safety in Malcolm Jenkins, whereas they really wanted to run a more complementary, interchangeable back group of safeties these last couple of years. And so we've seen a lot more cover 2 split coverage with Marcus May and Tyrann Mathieu. And there are strengths and weaknesses to both of those things. But even just looking at this one player and what they were able to do in zone coverage, just looking at what they were doing from a single high alignment versus a 2 high alignment, they were pretty adept in man coverage no matter what, but they were a lot better in single high alignment against deeper routes. And the term you use, and there's a whole grading sheet, but I used good. And then his ability in zone to do the same thing in split safety alignment was adequate. And that's a cannot do section. So the same thing, it's just there's one player in coverage or there's two players in coverage. And there's a lot of reasons why, and you have to explain why it comes down to mental processing, understanding how zones divide differently and what routes you really need to carry. And it was the same thing with intermediate routes where he could do those perfectly fine when he was in single high alignment and coming from a deeper field position. But if he was closer to those routes, he was kind of lacking that understanding of when they broke laterally from that split safety alignment because you're running at a different angle than you are coming straight down the field. So I know that got really mumbo jumbo-y, but my projection ended up being, yeah, I think he's a starter. You can win with him, but he's best used in a single high, typically man-oriented coverage scheme and best utilized when those in and out breaking routes in those intermediate routes, he's able to come to from a single high alignment versus that split safety alignment. And that's a lot of hoopla to say. I'm saying that he's a starting player and you could still put him in a too high alignment and he's going to be fine. But if you're a team looking for a free agent and you primarily run split safety coverage, then there really shouldn't be a reason at all that you're really looking for this guy to join your team. Whereas if you're looking for a guy that can play middle of the field, close that single high safety coverage, have that range to come down on those deeper routes and those intermediate routes, well, then this player is looking a lot more useful for what you're needing out of your team. And that's not even getting into run support and their ability to make open field tackles, where that might matter at some places more than others. There might be some schemes where they 100% expect their defensive backs to be able to come down and stop the run and offer that run support, understand angles and space, and have the functional strength to be able to make open field tackles. There are a lot of guys that aren't that great at that, but they have great range. So do you throw the whole player out? No. That's kind of how you look at it in free agency. When you're looking at it from a draft perspective, you can look at someone as, are we filling a need, or is there a vision here that we can see for them? And so whatever they do best, whatever team is looking for those characteristics is going to be watching them a lot more closely than a team that has a completely different skill set that they're looking for. And I know that I use safety terminology, but that's just because that's what I focused on in my scouting academy work. And it's the one that I could see the most nuance in, where, again, it's the same routes. It's the same pretty much thing. But when he's in a split safety alignment, his mental processing was that much slower. And it led to a lot more plays and results by the offense against him. And so a team that's looking for a single high safety is really looking for this type of guy, but one with that kind of complementary interchangeable system. You think of someone again like Marcus Williams, he doesn't really fit there. And so the reason I'm not talking about fit yet for either of these guys is because it requires a lot of work. And you might be able to do a quicker version of it. But with me spending so much time in college this year, I have a less good idea of what I guess each team's individual needs are. But I think you want to look first and foremost, are they able to develop that position well? Have they brought in guys that have been undrafted free agents, been developmental prospects, or are they only able to have production out of wide receivers that went in the first round of the NFL draft, for example? And, can a team develop a quarterback? Are they going to throw them to the wolves? Those are things that you can kind of look to on your face, but getting into the weeds is really what I like to do. And so me giving this lengthy explanation as for why I'm not going to do it on this episode hopefully resonates with people, but there are a lot of teams that would be lucky to have both those guys out there, but you really want them to go somewhere where they're going to succeed and utilize the traits that they have and do what they do best and focus on what they can do and not so much what they cannot do. There's a reason that goes second in the report. You're more focused on what they're able to do. It's easy to write a player off. What's more difficult is to find sometimes a diamond in the rough, find that they're really good at this specific trait, this specific situation. And then when you think about a guy like Jha'Quan Jackson telling me heading into the Senior Bowl that it doesn't matter what role on a team he's asked or tasked with doing, he is going to put his all into it. And he knows that that is the best thing for him. And he is just ready to play whatever role in whatever situation they give him, that spells the best recipe for success when you have the willing and patient and able guys that know that they might not have the immediate dream that they might have perhaps thought about when they were younger of going on and being wide receiver one, the first option on this team. The ability to be okay with being a role player is one of the more important traits of all. And when you talk about character, you cannot ask for better than you can out of these Tulane guys.